All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over some CSS, CSS3 fundamentals. In our first lecture, we went over inline CSS, internal CSS, external CSS. We were introduced to classes and IDs, which we'll keep using. Then we had a second lecture where we went through divs and colors. All right, in this lecture, I'm going to go through floating and positioning, which are highly integrated. They're in some ways floating is part of positioning, it really is. Then in the next lecture, I'm going to finish up the regular CSS stuff. So I'll go over margins, padding, borders, fonts, styling text, aligning text, styling links, and a little bit of further reading that we can look at for this. Then we'll have another lecture which will be just CSS3 specific stuff. Finally, I'll go back and, as mentioned or as promised, I will talk about the stuff in the CSS reference. All right, so let's start by talking about float and clear. Okay? The float property, as it says, specifies whether or not an item should float. Float is kind of a weird word because when you think of something floating, at least when I do, I think of it moving. But float here doesn't really mean moving. It means like kind of stuck to the left-hand side or stuck to the right-hand side. All right? When you don't want to float anymore, you clear. So where float specifies whether or not you want something to float, clear can turn off floating. So here's floating to the left, here's floating to the right. Now imagine this is your page. And if you float left, it goes to the left-hand side. If you float right, it goes to the right-hand side. So let's look at the example that they put in here. To keep it simple, I've already talked about internal, inline, CSS, etc. What I think I'm going to do is just keep putting everything in here into my external file. All right, so I've said if I've got an image, I want the image to float to the right. All right, and I want it to have zero margin on top, 0 right margin, 10 margin or 10 pixel margin on the bottom, and a 10 pixel margin on the left. All right, so that's what we have in there. So to try it yourself. So let's see. So we've got, let's grab this, and I'm going to save their image. Just what they're doing here is W3 GIF. Now I'm going to take their example and I'm going to grab it in there verbatim. All right. So coming back to here, I no longer need my paragraphs. So I'm going to comment all of those out along with that div. And I'm going to paste this in. Now it's going to look a little funky. Let's go back. Okay, in this example, the image will float to the right in the paragraph and the text will wrap around the image. We'll see if that's true in just a second. All right, so here's our image tag. It's what I just added here. So there's our image, there's our source, there's its width, there's its height. I've shown you already how you can get the height and width of an image. All right. And now they've got some lorem ipsum text, the same stuff I just showed you a couple minutes ago. Again, I'm just trying to set it up a little bit so it's easier for you to read what's going on here. Almost done. So please bear with me. All right, so if this works, okay, it's an image, and we said in our style sheet that images should float to the right and have that kind of a margin set up. We've saved it, so that's all set. Now, since it's an image, this should be doing just that, floating to the right, etc. Let's see if it does. There's our image floated to the right, and there's our text that works its way around it. So it did exactly what we asked it to do. And if you look here, there's the 10 pixels of, what was it, margin or padding? Of margin that we had. Okay, so remember, top, right, bottom, and left. All right. All right, again, I'm just going to run through their examples. To me, this makes the most sense to do it this way. You may or may not agree. So, div clear. If I put in another paragraph after this, and let's do that. All right, I'm going to just put in another paragraph right in here. So let me put in another paragraph. I am a new paragraph. Do I float, left, right, or neither? All right, and let's take a look. We haven't changed that. All right, doesn't look like it's doing anything, but if we wanted to make sure it wasn't doing anything, just make absolutely positive, we could come in here and we can add this div, and with that div, okay, we can either clear right, we could clear left, or we can clear both. And that's what I'm going to do. All right, so that div, I'm going to call it, instead of div, I'm going to make this an ID, and I'll call it clear both. Pretty obvious then what's going on. All right, so we're going to come back in here, and it may not look any different. So P, ID equal clear both. All right, let's run this. And it doesn't look any different. Now that's good, that's fine. But I want to show you something first. All right, and that is, I'm going to first put in a div. It's not going to have anything in it, but it's going to have an ID equal clear both. So that should do the clearing right there. All right. Let's make a new class and let's call it float right. All right. And we'll come in here and we'll have a new class, dot, that we call float right. And we're going to say here, float right. That's all we're putting. I'm not worrying about margins or anything else. I don't care how it looks. All right, I'm a new paragraph. Do I float left, right, or neither? I thought that would. I know what I didn't do. No, I did. It's a class. Class equal float right. Okay. So, did that change it? Did that move that over here? Pretty obvious what's going on. So I can float stuff on a page. All right, I can float it to the left, I can float it to the right, or I can have no floating whatsoever. All right. Notice if an element is taller than the element containing it and it's floated, it will overflow outside of its container. If you don't want that to happen, you can put overflow auto. As they say, it's sort of a hack, which means it works, but it's something that you're putting in and you really shouldn't have to. This is now considered a safer way of doing it. All right. It is common to do entire web layouts using the float property. And they're showing an example right here. So there would be your header. You've got some information here, and there's your footer. And they show an example of this. So let's grab all the stuff that they have. Let's copy it to the clipboard. Let's throw it into our CSS file. So header and footer will both have a background color of gray with white text and 15 pixels of padding. Columns will float to the left with 15 pixels of padding. Clear fix, I don't know if I need both those, but I'll leave it there. I'll have a menu with a width of 25% and content with a width of 75%. All right, now that's not going to make what we've got on the screen right now showing look any different because we haven't put any of that stuff in yet. So I can now go in to my file here and again comment out all of this stuff. All right. So now we can go and add, we've got all this, that's all fine and dandy, but we can go in and add all of our divs that we want to add inside of, all right, our body area. So put them right here. Again, this file's getting inordinately big, but it's fine. All right, so we've got a div with a class of header, a div with a class of clearfix. Inside of that div with a class of clearfix, all right, inside of there we've got an unordered list. And inside of that div with a class of clearfix, we've got another div with a class of column content. And in there we've got an H1 tag, and we've got a couple of P tags. The best way to learn how to do this, I look at this as always being a work in progress. Occasionally I'll do something and I get one of those gee whiz type of moments where I'm like, why did that happen that way? And I have to sometimes scratch my head and really think about it before it makes a lot of sense to me. All right, and there's our footer. Just being consistent with my own look and feel here. All right, so now let's save that and see what we've just built. There we go. So we've set up, using floats, a header area, some kind of a content area, and a footer area. Now, does this look the same way that it does in the book? Don't know. Let's go in here. Okay. Not sure why that looks the way it does, but let's take a look under the try it yourself and see what it looks like. Run, and that is what it's supposed to look like. I'm wondering with the menu, with the stuff that's in here, did I include the menu stuff? I've got menu and I've got content. What else is in there? Yep, I stopped right there. I didn't add this stuff. Got to be consistent, and I was not. So, I've got unordered lists inside of menus should look like this. The LIs that are inside a menu should look like this. When I hover over a menu, it should look like this. All right, this should dramatically change the way that this looks right here. Okay, so it's got that. You notice when I hover over it, how the color changes. And I've got the rest of my stuff. Again, all I'm doing is following the instructions that are shown in here. I'm not going to run through these, but please notice there are several examples, such as creating a horizontal menu. Okay, that's kind of a biggie, and we will look at that. We will use that later. This is just an unordered list that we told to display inline block with no text decoration. All right, and we set the background color and the text color. Not a big thing, to be honest with you. If I grab all this, I'm going to go back into my stuff that I just put in here, which was all of this, I believe. Remember, when I'm commenting out in CSS, it looks a slash star, and it ends with a star slash. So let's put this stuff, whoops, no, I'm sorry, Control Z, that's got to go in here. So again, let's comment out what we just did. Let's add that stuff here. Okay, well, that I did want to put in the CSS. Okay, whoops. All right, now I've got an unordered list in here. Save that, go to my style sheet, come down to the bottom and paste this in. All right, this says my unordered list style type none, which means remove the bullets, no margin, no padding, overflow hidden. The background color, the 333 is a version of gray. It should automatically float to the left. My list items, which are my menu items, any anchor tags should display inline block. They should be white, center aligned with some padding, and not be underlined. When I hover over them, they should turn to this color. Don't need this. All right, so let's save and run. And there it is. Now, it looks like I still have a dot after this, and I'm not sure why they put that there. But you can tell that all of this works. My reverse imaging works. The color of the text changes when I'm highlighting it, and the background color gets darker. That was all done through the CSS. So there's the background color. Again, I could take the time and go over every one of these. It's not going to make sense to do that. Here's some more information on float properties. And again, peruse your way through this. This is how you learn. All right? We've talked about for layouts, we've talked about inline block. So if we look at this, the old way using floats. So they've done this here using floats. And again, I should be able to grab all of this. This is all of the CSS right here. It's floating box. All right. I should be able to grab that. This is disjoint from the other stuff. So floating box and after box, that's all the new stuff. Save that, go to my index file. Now I can take all of this stuff that I've been working on, comment it all out, add the new stuff, which is in here. All right, and run. And you see what I get. Okay? Now, they do mention this is how they did this, and I'm going to leave this here. I'm not going to get rid of it. The old way using float. All right, I'm going to close a couple of these because I've got way too much stuff open here. All right, and I think next they're going to show another way of doing it. If I click next. No, they're not. So they show how to center things in a div, how to center images, pretty obvious. Margin auto, sometimes you'll see margin 0 auto instead of that. All right? So if you see this inside of someplace inside of CSS, usually it looks like 0 auto, which means 0 pixels left and right and automatically center. I'm sorry, this means 0 pixels top and bottom. This means automatically center left and right. So it's a very quick, down and dirty way to center things. All right. I'm not going to go over the combinators right now. So we looked at layout somewhat. So let's continue on with this. And now we're talking about the position property. And this is where we want something to be placed on a page. Let's go through these 4 examples that are here. Those meaning statically positioned, which is the default, relative position, so positioning something relative to something else, fixed, and absolute. Notice the position property specifies the type of positioning method used for an element. Those are the 4 types. Elements are positioned using top, bottom, left, and right, but these will not work unless the position property is set first. By default, static is the default. Statically positioned elements are not affected by top, bottom, left, and right. And any element that you have that's position static is not positioned in any special way. It flows with the page. So if we look at this, let's look at a div static. Give us some room here. So this says a div with a class of static. So we're setting the position to static and we're giving it a border. All right. Then if we come in here and we're going to set some text. Okay, we can now comment out all of this text that we had in here. All right, and add some new text. Again, we're up near 800 lines now. We're closing in on 800. All right, position static. An element with position static is not positioned. It just flows or goes with the normal flow of the page. So that's the way the paragraph is set up. The div with a class of static has position static. So how does this look? Not really any different. Remember, that is the default. Now, for some reason, I didn't get the border to show. Why wouldn't I have gotten that border to show? Probably because I didn't save my CSS. File. All right. So that's got the border around it. So that's position static. Again, static is the first of our positioning methods. It's not positioned in any special way. So that's the first one. Got to step it up. I'm already at 22 minutes. All right. Relative. An element with position relative is positioned relative to its normal position. So as it says there, setting the top, right, bottom, and left of a relatively positioned element will cause it to be adjusted from its normal position. So let's add the div relative. We already have the div static, so we don't need this one anymore. All right, so we have the div static. Let's add now a div relative. So notice the difference. Position relative, we are putting a 30 pixel left on it, and we're putting a border which is the same color as the last one that we had. Let's make sure we save this time. Now go back into our HTML file, and we're going to add basically the same stuff we added before, except this time the position is relative as opposed to before when we did this when the position was static. Other than that, it's basically the same thing. So let's take a look at how it's changed. All right. That's that 30 pixels left that we put in there. So you can see how it moved over. It's relative to its normal position. All right. Fixed. An element with position fixed is positioned relative to the viewport. In other words, it always stays in the same place. Sometimes you'll want to do this so that, for example, as I scroll through here, notice how this menu that's up on top doesn't change. All right. So that is set up with a position of fixed. As it says, it does not leave a gap in the page where it would normally be located. So let's add fixed positioning here into our CSS file. Position fixed, bottom 0 pixel, right 0 pixel with a width of 300, same color we've had before. All right, we'll come back in here again. And we're going to add our text. Same text basically we've been adding, except now we're using fixed. So let's look at this. There it is, position fixed. There it is on the screen. Notice Let's try, I'm going to try to put a boatload of line breaks in here. There's 5, 10, 15, 20. There's 25 line breaks. All right, that should be plenty. So let's, okay. Now notice, see that? How this isn't moving. It is fixed in position. Even though I'm moving down on the page, this is in a fixed position. And finally, absolute. As it says, when an element is absolutely positioned, it's relative to the nearest ancestor. All right? A positioned element is one whose position is anything except static. So let's look at these. Div relative and div absolute. I think we had a relative in there already in our CSS. There was our relative, so I'm going to comment this out. All right, and now I'm going to put this in. So I've got a div in there for relative and a div in there for absolute. With the relative, the positioning is relative. With the absolute, the positioning is absolute. Should make sense. All right, again, we're going to come in here. All right, and let's put in our text. Did we save our style sheet? Yes, we did. Put in our text. Again, I would so strongly suggest that you run through and do this stuff yourselves. People say, well, Jeff, I don't have the time. I'd say make the time. If it's important enough for you to understand what's going on here, it should be important enough for you to take the time to go through it. All right, so let's save and now let's run this. Not sure why that's still the fixed one. Because I didn't save. Run. And there we go. Now notice this has a position absolute. Let's go back into here and where we had all those line breaks. Let's see if those can come in handy again for us here. All right, and you're saying, wait a minute, that's got an absolute position. Yeah, but it's inside of something that's relative. That's why. Because now, if this was not inside of this div, then it wouldn't move. But remember, with absolute positioning, it's relative to its nearest ancestor. The ancestor of this div is this div. That's why it works like that. So what you saw in here was static, whereas it says not positioned in any special way, the default. Then we went to relative to its normal position. Then we went to fixed down here, and you saw that when I brought in those, again, you're not seeing it now, but it doesn't move. Okay. I guess there it is. Then we went to absolute. So we looked at the 4 different methods that are in here. We looked at static, we looked at relative, we looked at fixed, we looked at absolute. That finishes up this lecture. We have now gone this far. So when I come back, I'm going to finish up the CSS3 part by talking about all the stuff that you see here. Margins, padding, borders, fonts, styling text, aligning text, styling links, and a little bit of further reading. All right, so I'll be back with that shortly.